really excited to talk to you all today about strengthening your professional learning. We're going to have some time at the end of the webinar today to answer questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature for any questions you have that come up as we're talking. And again, we'll make time to discuss at the end of the webinar today. All right, so before we get started, I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself and my colleague Cammie. I'm Elizabeth Ramsey. I'm the Senior Managing Director of Program Services at Instruction Partners. I support a lot of our core service design and implementation. I've worked on many of our thought leader pieces, including the Curriculum Support Guide, the professional learning conditions and practices that we'll talk about today. And before working at Instruction Partners, I ran a teacher training and certification program and did support with curriculum adoption for small and large school systems and academic strategy across the country. And before all that, I was a 8th grade English teacher in Texas and ran a 612 content department. So like many folks at Instruction Partners, I am a nerd when it comes to instruction and learning, and I'm always happy to share space with other folks who love to learn as well. And I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have with me my dear colleague Cammie Mabry, who's one of the authors of this work.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Cammie Mabry, Director of Instructional Support here at Instruction Partners. I've been here for almost, I think, 4 years now. And I have had the opportunity to be a content lead, work on the program team, work on this project. Before this, I am and will always be a math nerd. I taught high school math for about 10 years, and then I transitioned into being a math district leader and achievement specialist. So I have just enjoyed being in education and still enjoy the work. I am excited to dig into this work with you for something that we all know will help move the needle with students.
Thank you so much, Cammie. So a little bit about Instruction Partners. We're a nonprofit organization focused on helping small and mid-sized school systems, as well as regional and state organizations across the country. And we partner with school leaders to help them understand the state of instruction in their schools and create a plan for improvement. We also help school and system leaders diagnose and strengthen sustainable, content-specific professional learning systems so that teachers can deliver exceptional Tier 1 instruction that addresses every student's learning needs. And in our work with school leaders all across the country, we've found that there is often a lack of clarity about the purpose and function of PL structures, and that can create a significant barrier to supporting teachers, improving instruction, and engaging students in rigorous and meaningful learning experiences. So what we found is that most school leaders agree on the importance of dedicated time for teachers to learn and plan together. And in our work with schools, we found little agreement on what that time and feedback should actually look like. And it seems like the term in particular, professional learning community, or PLC, means something different to everyone. Like I like to say it's one of those terms that means everything and nothing, because the definitions are so varied that it doesn't hold a ton of weight. So topics might cover anything from administrative updates to curriculum review to parent engagement. And these don't always feel tied to the work that teachers are doing every day or to their growth. And similarly, observation and feedback routines can carry their own sets of questions, right? Who should observe classrooms? How often and why? How do teachers receive actionable feedback? And how are they supported to implement that feedback? And sometimes when we don't have clear answers to those questions, observations can feel like gotchas to teachers, or the purpose is just unclear and can break some trust among the system. We all know educators' time is precious and constrained, and clarity about what we are spending time on is a need to have, not a nice to have, and a requirement for how we're honoring folks' work and the time that we all spend together. So the definition that we're using for professional learning is the preparation needed for teachers to deliver content in a way that meets the needs of all students. And before we get into the findings around what we've learned about professional learning, we wanted to invite you all to participate in the chat here. If you could wave a magic wand and do one thing for your professional learning system, what would you do? Awesome. I'm seeing where we'd focus, time and opportunities. Time's a big one. Relevance, actionable. I love the phrase, never interrupt a teacher prep time. It is very precious. Teaching is one of the hardest jobs that is out there. You need that time. Value in learning, Mm. Alignment goals. Wonderful ideas here. If only we had these magic wands, right? Like we know that this is the hard work and this is the work that so many of you all take on every day.
And so when we dug into this work, we found that there was growing evidence base around the works for effective teacher professional learning. The Research Partnership for Professional Learning, we all know, we call it RIPPLE, recently published emerging evidence on the promising features of professional learning that support ongoing teacher learning and development. There is widespread and rigorous evidence that teachers can and do learn from each other. That teachers improve their practice more in schools that are more where there are more collaborative workplaces, and that interventions designed to promote teacher collaboration around instructional practices can improve teacher practice and student outcomes. And so 2 years ago at Instruction Partners, we set out on a project to get really clear on the factors that make professional learning effective. We dug into the research and piloted a new approach to instructional leadership support in 16 schools. Based on everything we learned, we created resources called the Professional Learning Conditions and Practices that support two key professional learning structures: collaborative planning and observation and feedback. In our work with hundreds of school leaders across the country, we found that there are two key professional learning structures: collaborative planning, which supports teachers' ability to plan and deliver excellent and equitable learning experiences. And then there's observation and feedback, which provides time for instructional leaders to observe instruction and provide targeted feedback that supports teachers in strengthening their practice. For collaborative planning, teachers need time to reflect, to share, and to prepare to teach, ideally with colleagues in the same grade band using the same materials. Effective collaborative planning ensures that teachers have the time they need to set clear lesson outcomes, to anticipate and adjust their instruction to meet unfinished learning needs, and improve their in practice in a specific focus area. When thinking about collaborative planning, we're talking about a space where common minds come together to practice and encourage growth and development. This could be your teacher's PLC time, or it can also be your leadership team meetings, because when we think about a collaborative planning place, we're talking about any space where you collaboratively come together to plan and better your practices. When you think about observation and feedback, we know that all teachers need clarity on where to focus their improvement efforts so that they can strengthen instruction. Effective observation and feedback provides that clarity, leading to clearer instructional expectations across the school and then ultimately better outcomes for students. Now, most schools already have these elements of structure in place. And so we found that the conditions in which both of these structures are rooted and grounded in are crucial to ensuring that teachers get the most from professional learning and students get the most from their teachers' instruction. In our pilots, we found that if we attended to these conditions alongside implementation, then we could see faster progress. And so there are 7 essential conditions I want to lift for you all. The first being vision. There's a clear and communicated vision around the purpose of the structure. And then time. There's a dedicated and consistent time for teachers to meet regularly. You think about processes where there are protocols and processes in place to ensure effective use of the time. Your roles, where all staff members understand their roles and responsibilities within the structure. We have the training, where facilitators are trained and well prepared to fulfill their responsibilities in alignment with the vision. And then we have investment and affirmation. Investment speaks to teachers and facilitators being invested in the structure and the time. And then the affirmation speaks to the interaction between facilitators and teachers, where we're affirming teachers' perspectives, their efforts, and contributions. Too often, schools do not dedicate enough time to strengthen these conditions. They start with implementing a new protocol or a practice, and they inevitably end up needing to go backwards to address an additional condition.
Cammie, thank you for lifting that. I'm like channeling back to when I was leading PLCs. And I remember so many times where I'm like, oh, this protocol is going to be my answer. Like, this is going to fix the thing for me. And I would try to lead it and it would fall totally flat because one of these things wasn't in place. So we're trying to make so many of those implicit factors explicit for you all
Mhm.
for us to help us understand how to really make sure our professional learning systems are singing.
I'm so glad you brought that up because one thing it makes me think about is we look at these linearly, but they're not. They actually are interconnected and they work together. And specifically, when you think about investment and of affirmation, those really depend on how well we've done with the vision, the time, the process, the roles, and the training. Because if we can get those other ones together, then investment should build and affirmation should start to live. But they work together as a whole. So there's no one right way or one right condition to lean into. We just know that we have to address them.
Yes. Yeah, let's get into some of the lessons that we're learning as we implement these. Um, oh wait, sorry. There we go. We have lots of lessons, lots of slides with lessons. So the first one is stakeholder input is critical. So one of the things that we found is we have the survey tools and we have rubric tools, both of which we'll walk you through and share with you all on this call. And oftentimes we ask leaders to start by reflecting on those, and they'll evaluate the state of things, what they're saying. Then we often find that if you give those same tools to teachers or to instructional coaches, you might get a different set of answers. And a lot of times that dissonance is really powerful for figuring out the area you might want to dig in on. So trying to see things from multiple lenses has been really helpful in figuring out where to work. The next is to achieve a shared goal, you need a shared vision. We've found very often that a clear vision is one of the key starting places to improving your systems and structures. And with this, like most schools we saw in the poll, right? You have time held. There is time and place for observation and feedback or for collaborative planning, but very frequently not everyone's on the same page about that time. And so starting with that vision can be really helpful for starting to make that system effective. The next is no one right way, and Cammie was starting to allude to this. There is no one magical protocol or magical next step that is going to fit and fix everyone's needs. The protocol is meant to serve the higher purpose of supporting teachers' learning and student outcomes. And so you have to shift these things to make them work for you. So a few contextual aspects that we're seeing being important here. In collaborative planning in particular, some folks have collaborative planning as often as once a week. Some people have it once a month. Some people have it for 45 minutes after school. Some have it for 90 minutes, right? There's lots of different time blocks that might affect how you use that time. There's also different participant makeups. Maybe it is in content bands like grades 9 to 12. Maybe it's grade specific. And then there's also curricular factors, what materials you're using, right? So you think about some of these protocols, et cetera, that you then want to adjust based on the needs of your community. The next big takeaway is that changing routines is hard. I'm sure this is one that all of us viscerally know on this call. It's really challenging to change conditions, build leaders' capacity and skills, build leaders and teachers' skills and knowledge in a curriculum, change preparation, discussion, or follow-up routines. None of that is just overnight work or that magic wand that we were discussing. It takes a lot of time. And so we've developed some action plans to support folks to help you figure out the bite-sized steps you can take to help make these changes stick. The next is that this work is both technical and adaptive. So to speak to the challenge of all of this work, right, it's also not just a checklist. Cammie was talking about investment and affirmation, and so often those are outcomes, right? Like that is something that kind of comes along with a lot of the clarity work you're doing, the roles and responsibilities work you're doing, the training work you're doing. And it's relational work in addition to some of that clarity that you're setting up. And a lot of these pieces like work together. Go ahead, Cammie. Were you jumping? Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were jumping in. I was like, yes, here for your story. And then this last one is that relationships matter, right? So we're all humans working in this system together, and our identities show up at work, our personalities show up at work, and all of that matters within these systems. And really attending to these pieces and to how that plays out in your culture will make a difference to how your systems are working. So we're continuing to build our understanding of what's working and not working every day, and we'll continue to share that out with you all. And we're trying to pattern these things as we continue to improve our resources and supports for folks.
We also found that there are a handful of high leverage professional learning practices that can meaningfully raise the level of instruction for all students. And so what you see here is that when we think about collaborative planning, you have unit internalization, lesson preparation, and student work analysis. That can be three high leverage practices that can show up in your collaborative planning time as a way to focus. And then when we think about observation and feedback, we have instructional rounds as well as ongoing feedback cycles as opportunities of what this. And we know this is not exhaustive, but we do know that from what we've seen that these are the three tools and these are the practices along with side both of them that we know can also help that you can leverage during these practices. And so, as we know, there are so many lessons learned. And so the first lesson that we learn is that we have to center on students. We've always had students with unfinished learning needs. That is not something new. That is something that was exacerbated during the pandemic, but it wasn't new to us during the pandemic. And right now, we know that that is especially true. And so as you think about implementing the practices, start by centering on the unfinished learning needs of your students. Another thing we thought about or that we saw and we learned was that we had to stay grounded in the curriculum. Many of the practices that we see work best when they are tailored and anchored to your curriculum materials. It increases the relevance for teachers and keeps the discussion focused on learning and the students. It also supports with building coherence across your system. And so if we can stay grounded in the curriculum, we saw that more growth and more relevance for teachers, which is one thing that we saw as a dissonance from a lot of the rubrics that we looked at. This one that learning was very key to me. It was keep your eye on the learning goal in regards to PL. So this is my most important takeaway. Whether it be collaborative planning or observation and feedback, the ultimate goal is that educators are walking away with something that betters their practice. It might be great to complete your checklist. It might be cool to have a powerful agenda with all these things that you've done. But if the individuals who have come into this space or engaged with the observation and feedback cycle have not engaged in a way that has bettered their practice, then we might need to go back and make some adjustments. Here's an example I can tell you. Recently, we observed a fourth grade PLC. Within that time, the team internalized 4 different lessons in preparation for the next week. 4 lessons, 50 minutes. They could name the standard, the aspect of rigor, but we could not be sure that they walked away being able to connect the first problem to the second problem, or even be able to say how all of these lessons connected together to get to the ultimate goal of what this topic was talking about. And so in this space, leaders were so focused on how many lessons the teacher worked through or how efficient they were using this time, but we could not learn what we did not know or could not name what teachers learned in the space. We were focused on getting the protocols done, but could not identify what the lessons of that day learned, what the lesson was about that day, what the purpose of the lesson was, what the purpose was in the flow of the lessons. And so it's so important for us to not just focus on all of the things that we can get done in that time, but making sure that the teachers walk away knowing the big idea of the lesson, and we get an opportunity to do that with our tools. Another lesson learned, follow up and monitor progress. It is hard to know if what you're doing is working. And so the only way to do that is to follow up and to see where you are. There isn't a lot out there that shows how the practices should look in action. Sure, there are protocols, there are tools, but how do we know if these things are being implemented effectively, and if the implementation is leading to the outcome that we want to see? We recommend checking out our progress monitoring tools. They highlight the key moves for each practice that help lead to changes in teaching and learning and can really ground your reflections. And then one of the last lessons is to integrate the practices and the conditions. we found that you can often improve conditions and practices side by side, meaning you can work on the vision while implementing a protocol like student work analysis. These two things don't have to be separate of each other. It doesn't have to be a checklist or super linear. Often you're implementing the practice while also thinking about improving the underlying condition helps move the needles. Teachers are still getting what they need, and we're starting to see this collaborative planning or observation and feedback structure move in the direction that we want it to move into. So to put everything back together, we have enabling conditions paired with intentional professional learning practices that can help leaders build strong, sustainable professional learning structures. In addition, we created a robust set of resources to help leaders strengthen their professional learning conditions and practices for each of these structures, as you see below.
All right. We wanted to share a few challenges that have been pretty common for folks. I like to orient through what my personal problems are. Maybe this is about the phase of life I'm in. I have a toddler and a 5-month-old. Like I feel like I'm heavy in a problem-solving space. But there's three like major leadership challenges that we've seen people kind of orient in. So, and this can be a great way to figure out like, where do I see myself in these and how might that help me dig into these resources? Because there's quite a bit on the website. So the first is I have PL structures in place, but they are not leading to changes in instructional practice. And for this, we recommend trying the conditions rubric as a leader and also giving it to your teachers to try to figure out where to begin. So here on the screen, you can see one of our rubrics, and this one is for collaborative planning. So for example, we have a school leader who is a single site school leader, and he is supporting all content areas alone, doing that hero's work every day. And when we asked him about his professional learning, he was like, I think it's going okay. Like we have collaborative planning. I show up, it's all right. And then when we talked to the teachers, they had a different perspective, particularly around the vision for the time. And so we saw dissonance in their feedback, and it helped him realize like, oh, I was very clear on what the vision for this time was, but my teachers aren't as clear on this. And maybe they're not actually bought into the purpose of the time that I see. And so they work together to kind of co-construct the vision together to figure out how to move the time forward. So this might be a good place to start if you're really trying to figure out, hey, where do I begin here? I know I have these structures, but I'm just not sure they're working. The second challenge I'll highlight is that I know I need to put in place a new PL structure, but I don't know where to start. So maybe you're in a situation where you're like, I want to launch something, but I just don't even know where to begin here, right? And something that I'd guide you towards are one of our action plans. So this is the one for collaborative planning. We also have these for observation and feedback as well, but they'll walk you through, here are the concrete steps for how I actually launch this structure. And it's by each of the conditions that we've talked about. And there are even the resources linked in multiple places as well that you can use to help you execute this. So for example, we had a partner with a large leadership team that they were trying to figure out how to set up their collaborative planning time. And so they knew they wanted to start with vision just because the importance that we've been talking about with that. They actually pulled up this action plan, went to the vision section and started working through these steps. And we did that together side by side to help launch the work for them in their school system. And then Cammie's going to walk us through the third challenge.
So the third challenge, I have the essential school conditions in place, but I still don't think that my professional learning time is effective. And so for that, I would say, why don't you just go right back to those action plans that Elizabeth was talking about? And there are surveys linked within the action plans where we can actually start to get feedback from the participants. And so when you think about it, we have a large partner who has implemented the collaborative planning structures, or PLCs, from the top down. There is time built into everybody's calendar. They are having PLC time daily for every grade band, for every content throughout the schools. However, the leadership is still unclear if the PLC time is leading to the impact that they want. The school leadership are feeling like, hey, we're having all the protocols, we're doing all the protocols, but we don't know if it's actually working. And so for this, let's get some actual data to figure out what's working, what's not working, so we can have an actual entry point into what the next step could be.
Thank you, Cammie. And I wanted to highlight one other resource idea here that could be helpful. We also have progress monitoring rubrics. We talked a little bit about those earlier. So for something like collaborative planning, say that you have lesson preparation, there is an actual rubric that you can use that walks you through, here are the outcomes of this time. Are we meeting these and to what degree? And I guess someone wrote in the chat focusing on the dance, not the music, right? So it gets us out of that, like we're just completing the protocol. What are the outcomes of the protocol and have we actually met those? So those rubrics can be helpful for reflecting on your practice as well. All right, we have saved the rest of our time for some questions and answers. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll start talking through some of these together. Cammie, I'm going to pull out the first one that I see here. Do you recommend that a leader tackle the conditions in order? Is it better to put one at a time in place, or are there some that can be established simultaneously?
My honest recommendations would be, I would say start with vision and time. Specifically time. If there is not, especially for collaborative planning, if there is not time built into the calendar, then we need to establish a sacred time built into the calendar to kind of speak to some of the things y'all all talked about with magic wands. Like, can we just have unprotected time? And once you get the unprotected time, then I would say absolutely you can work at two things at one time. You can say, well, let's actually get to this vision and let's think about the protocols, because there's no point in having a time for a place with nothing to do. So like, how do we use this protocol? How do we better this protocol? But how do we ensure that this protocol is aligned to the vision that we want from the time? And so I would say yes to those things. My additional guidance would be to look at the five: the vision, the time, the protocols and practices, roles and responsibilities. And what was that last one? Let me pull it up. Yeah, and the training. I would look at those first together, because I feel like the other two will work themselves out and they will begin to get better as you get better at those five.
Yeah, investment effort. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. There's kind of some that I think of as on a buddy system. Like vision and protocols often work really well together, because you can think about, here's how I want it to look, here's how I'm going to actualize that. Training kind of flows with that one. Another one, is it appropriate for instructional coaches to lead PLCs?
Yes. Yes, it's appropriate for instructional coaches to lead PLCs. And I honestly say the way we look at it in many school systems is you look for the one who has the content knowledge to be able to drive the work. And then we go back to the facilitation. How are we giving people sacred time to prepare to be able to engage in those PLCs? And who's coming in as a learner and who's coming in to lead the work? Because there will be spaces where you may be a new IS and your AP may need to lead the work, and that's completely okay. It's like, who's coming into the as a learner, what are our roles and responsibilities as we enter into the space? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Who's best fit to achieve those outcomes? And how are we making the time sacred for preparation to go into those spaces?
What are your recommendations for in-school day professional learning sessions, particularly in the context that staffing is a challenge in many schools right now and getting time is a challenge in many schools right now?
There are so many things. I think those are layers. My recommendations in regard to leadership structures, I think if staffing is just trying and we're struggling day to day, then there could be some vision work and alignment work that we could do on the front end to ensure that we're all very clear about what we're going into, the purpose that we're going into this, and why we're doing it. Because I think that could also help with just culture and community. When you think about that, if I had to think about a specific practice in collaboration, my specific practice would be units. I would focus in on units because of staffing being the issue and knowing that that would be one meeting where we get more things done versus lesson. But I think you have to think about the context of your school, think about the needs of your school and where the work is, and that's what you lean into. And I would just say, use the surveys and get support from the teachers. Will tell you what they need. They'll tell you what they need.
I know, that's right. I love your point about unit internalization, because I do think that's like a good bang for your buck. One, the other thing I'm thinking is I think sometimes we get into our heads that you need a certain amount of time for it to be effective. Like I need 90 minutes or I need every week. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think like the minimum range that we've seen folks make it work in is probably 30 minutes, but that's like with tight practice protocol and culture
Yep.
and every other week. And so it might even just be helpful to like try to be generative about your time. Because I think sometimes I will say like, oh, well, that's not long enough. So that time doesn't even count. And I think that like we can make it work in the margins a little bit more sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. It's all in what you're trying to achieve in the time. What do we want teachers to walk away better knowing? What do we want
Right.
leaders to walk away knowing more?
Right. Well, I'm even thinking too of systems we've seen that chunk it, right? Where it's like we're just
Mm-hmm.
going to do this part of the lesson in this 30 minutes, this part of the lesson in the next, right? Like
Yep.
there's some creative workarounds.
I've seen that. And I think what I've also seen is this idea of the highest leverage moment. So, like in ELA, I've heard a lot of people talking about the importance of understanding the purpose of the lesson and the purpose that you're trying to achieve in the lesson. That's actually the same for math. What is the purpose and the aspect of rigor that we're trying to achieve in this lesson? And how are we ensuring that we spend our time making sure the teachers, the leaders know how to get to that? And
Mm,
do that well, because that actually covers a multitude of things.
yeah, I love that point. Um, any tips or best practices you can share for developing effective PL in virtual settings?
Yeah. One thing I can say is pre-work is amazing, being very clear about what you're trying to achieve. What I would say is, especially in virtual time, it is so difficult to engage people. So you really have to know your team and what makes your team the most productive in those spaces. And so for some people, that will be, we're going to come in and create pre-work, and then we're going to spend a lot of time collaborative discussing things. And then in some spaces, it might be, we're going to actually just do the thing together even though we're in virtual spaces. And so I would say first practice is figuring out how your team is most productive. Secondly is how can you maximize that time to do the work collaboratively that they could not do by themselves? And so like, since you have them together, what are the things you're trying to achieve collaboratively that you couldn't do by themselves? And then I would also look into some different, like we use Zoom a lot, but then I also use Nearpod, or what other thing can you pull into that space so that you can ensure productivity and that people feel like they're getting a good space and they use for their time.
Um, Great. Thank you. Another one I know is near to both of our hearts, in spaces like K-5, where teachers are responsible for all of the content areas, right? How do you recommend going about making sure teachers have support for all of those content areas with limited time?
Yeah, and so we've seen this, what we've seen normally, especially when there is like one person does math, one person does ELA, one person does internalized science. I actually don't recommend that. I would actually recommend that maybe you have a day for math, a day for science, a day for ELA, a day for social studies, which gives them all an opportunity to engage in the process and build that muscle memory each time so that they can transfer the learning and be able to do it on their own, but also be able to do it in a more efficient way. Because time is a lot. Time is the one thing we never get more of that we always ask for more of. And then being really honest about where teachers are right now and the load that they're carrying. And so how can we create protocols? How can we create a structure that gets them to the intended outcome in a time that does not keep them from being a human being?
I love the part about human beings. Relationships matter. And on that note, it's such an important takeaway. What are some of the things that leaders can do to support their relationships with teachers?
You know what, leaders? Most teachers just want you to show up and be in the learning with them and be the person that they can call on to ask for when they don't understand. That's the we do tons of focus groups with teachers, leaders, and students. And the one thing that I hear as a trend is I just want the support. I want to know that my leader understands the work that I'm doing, which means they want you to show up as a leader so you can engage and understand the type of work they're doing and what they're experiencing during the work, so that when they come to you with something, they have a true moment of you understand their experience more than just like giving out things to do and directives. And so that is the one thing. They feel more supported when you are walking alongside them, shoulder to shoulder in the work, learning the work, being very transparent. Like, one thing we have said over and over again is, I am not asking anyone to be an expert, especially if you're engaging in a new high quality curriculum, because we are learning things differently than the way we were taught. And so that's a very vulnerable moment for us to come in and say, like, hey, I didn't even know it was taught like that. But we're learning together. So I'm not asking you to be an expert, but I am asking you to be a learner and to continue wanting to learn and to grow. And so if you can model that for teachers, they will feel more supported in the work.
I love that point. There's also, we do have some action plans too around affirmation and investment that you can check out. They're based on the Search Institute framework. I think the other one too is we've seen vulnerability just go a really long way, and being authentic with folks. And the other relationships takeaway that comes to mind is the parallel between the relationships that leaders build with teachers and teachers build with students. It all tends to kind of mirror each other in the system. And so that can be another way to think about it, is look for what you're seeing between your students and teachers as you think about your approach with your teachers. There's one in the chat here. When we say leader, how are we defining that? And how does that fit into evaluation? A few thoughts here. We're using leader as your instructional leader. That could be principal, AP, coach, teacher, leader. There's lots of different staffing models and approaches here. And I'd say similarly, I've seen lots of different approaches as well for evaluation, and there's various pros and cons here. Like having the same person lead PLCs and do evaluation can be helpful for efficiency, but can make the culture a little more challenging because sometimes people feel less vulnerable if they know evaluation is on the table. So if you have the staffing model to support it, that can be helpful to separate those two functions. But again, a lot of this is just based on the constraints of your system. And I'd say, like, my key takeaway here is that you can make it work as a single site school leader, or you can make it work with a large distributed instructional leadership team. There's just different trade-offs and focus areas. Anything that you'd want to add there, Cammie? Okay.
I was going to say, we actually have examples of a single site school leader doing just that. And we also have examples of, we have a major school district that we've also done the work with within CBPL. So yes.
Yeah. The next question is if we have examples or stories from schools or districts that have data evidence around how this has improved outcomes. Do you want to share one from the pilots or from this year?
Sure. I can share from this year. Last year, we took a focus within one of our elementary schools here in Texas. We basically pulled in a group of fourth grade teachers who really wanted to do the work. And so we focused their PLC time on really getting clear about how to do about their structure of time that they were using in their PLC time. And so the majority of the time was spent on doing the work and the purpose. So we really leaned into the lesson internalization portion. As a result, this fourth grade team had the highest results on the state test last year. And two of their teachers are now master teachers based off of the growth and achievement that they saw. And so we have like evidence that if you really get granular in your PLC time and focus it, that you can see the impact. But there is a willingness and a safety and a vision. Like, we knew what the vision was for that time and how we were going to focus our energy every time we came together. And as a result, we did see those results.
Thank you for sharing that one. It's the other thing too that I'll add here is conditions work takes time, right? So like there's kind of like a trickle down thing here where if you're setting up the structures and systems, you then have to get the practices within those working effectively. And then that leads to teacher practice change, which then leads to student outcome change. So it can be, it can take some time. And there's multiple layers of, like, when I think about results, there's multiple layers here, right? Like, we've successfully seen folks move on their rubrics for the conditions. We've also seen teacher practices change on an instrument like the Instructional Practice Guide as a result of improvement in these conditions. And to Cammie's point, we also have hopefully seen student outcomes change as well, knowing that there's a lot of factors that go into those pieces. But some of it's kind of putting together all the puzzle pieces, right? Like, this change is a little bit complex. but we have seen lots of folks improve from a focus on their professional learning systems.
Mhm. And one thing I'll also add is what we've also seen is as their practice improves, you also see that on the evaluation rubric. Although we don't do evaluative things, their improved practice will lead to better evaluation scores because those things are so aligned most of the time. And I know that's a big concern for most people.
Another question, are there any conditions that surprised you, either because they were more or less important than you thought?
Hmm. I wouldn't say more or less important. I would say overlooked. And I think that is the roles and responsibilities. I think through the first draft of this, we left roles and responsibilities as a condition out and always assumed that roles and responsibilities would just be a thing. And quickly realized that people not being clear about who or what or who was doing what and how things were being done and who was responsible was a major gap in the things that we saw. And so it was never that we didn't think it was important, but we definitely overlooked the importance of it being an actual condition. Another one is, like I said, we always knew that time and vision was important. What we also recognized was the importance of time within the structure. Sometimes you're trying to figure out what structure should I work on in my school system? Should I work on observation and feedback? Should I work on collaborative planning? That's when we realized that time was super important, because if you're already in the middle of a school year and you do not have time scheduled in your master schedule for collaborative planning, it is going to be difficult for you to work on that structure and see it get better in PLCs because your time is just not there. And so we also looked at it with like, what do we have available and how are we moving? But everything else, it feels like they're all important in their own kind of ways because they're so interconnected.
Yeah. I think one of the ones that kind of surprised me, because I thought it would carry more weight, and I already revealed my vulnerability on this one, is the protocols. I really, there was a chapter of my leadership where it felt like protocols were the answer. And it was helpful to kind of discover all of the things that they go alongside. And it just like doubles down on your point where it's like a lot of these work together, and you think about the kind of rising tide that lifts all the boats, right? Like you kind of get these all singing and it makes a difference.
But I'm so happy you shared that because many people feel like protocols, I think that's a universal thing. If I just had this protocol, that it would work. What we found with protocols is having those protocols are amazing, but if people are not clear about the why for the protocol or what you're trying to achieve for the protocol, or even the needs of the teachers when using certain protocols, then the protocols fall flat. So we can have a very clearly stated, this is how we're going to rehearse lessons. This is how we're going to do student work analysis. But if teachers are at a place where they really just need to internalize, then the nicely fit protocol that you have will fall flat. And so like there's a balance of having all of these things, being very clear about the purpose. Again, I go back to the lessons learned, because we have people who are doing the protocols, who are doing the work, but not seeing the outcome that they want to see. And it's because we lost sight of the purpose. Now we're really clear on checking boxes, but teachers can't actually, we can't say that teachers' practice have been better. And that we have to keep that at the forefront. Professional learning. It is a space where we want our teachers, our leaders to get learning that better their practice. And so if you keep that front of mind when you go into observation and feedback, what am I giving? What kind of feedback am I going to give that's going to better this person's practice? If I keep it in mind when I have a PLC time, what are they doing in this space that is going to better their practice, which is going to help us achieve student outcomes? Having that at the forefront changes the way you walk into those spaces.
I'm smiling because I have so often felt the pull of walking into one of those spaces and thinking, but I just have this one update, but I just have like one policy that we need to go over. But I think you're right. It's that kind of the dedicated focus on the goal there really makes a difference.
And it's like not saying that that update can't be there, but I think that update can be saved for the last 5 minutes, right? Because if we do it at the first 5 minutes, it's going to turn into 20 minutes very easily when it just needed to be 5.
It's like you're speaking from experience from working with me before. That's
I I might be speaking from my own personal experiences of things I've done and wish I could not talk about ever again. Who knows?
Okay, another question from the chat. If you're still in the process of adopting HQIM, how do you think about these practices? That's a great one.
I think these practices can stand outside of HQIM. I think having the condition, if we do nothing but make sure we have conditions in place, then we're at a good space. And I think these systems and structures can actually operate outside of HQIM. Of course, I am a big fan of HQIM, and you can still go ahead and make sure you have the time in place, and you can still go ahead and make sure you have a clear vision in place for what you want to do at that time. And then as you begin to implement your HQIM or determine which one works for you, you can start to think about what protocols that may cause for, what kind of facilitation, what kind of training my people might need. But it doesn't mean that you have to like just not make sure the system, the structure is up and running before HQIM comes into place.
Yeah, I love this question and that point because it's so important to think about how these two major levers for instructional improvement talk to each other. Like HQIM can be such a great way to support teacher practice, but if you have a professional learning system that is totally agnostic to your HQIM, that's really confusing for teachers. So if you're in that process, I agree with Cammie, where it's like maybe you don't have the new materials, you're still thinking about how you strengthen your professional learning and your collaborative planning and your observation and feedback. But as you're adopting those materials, you're also keeping an eye on what do I need to change about these two structures so that they speak to my curriculum. And that might be specific protocols. It might be the type of feedback you give in classrooms, but really thinking about coherence and alignment as you go through that process. There's also, please feel free to check out our curriculum support guide on the website. Phase 2 works through all of this preparing to launch and aligning your professional learning to your high quality instructional materials. Another question, is there an example of PLC time being outside the contract day? I can think of some of these. This one's like dicey because it so depends on your local context and union rules, et cetera. I know some school systems, if this is within line with their policies and how things work in their district and union rules, I do know folks who have meetings outside of the contract day or school day, but again, that's like super dependent on your localized context. And I've seen people do that weekly after school for usually no more than 45 minutes. Any other questions coming up for folks? Okay, you all, thank you so much for spending time with us. We'll be sending out these resources and tools after the webinar. I did want to share just gratitude towards our funders who have helped us accomplish this work. And we have a survey always. You heard a lot about surveys during this session, and we would really appreciate it if you'd fill it out, give us some feedback on what resonated with you and what we could improve for next time. Thank you all.